Under the radiant sunset casting hues of orange and pink across the sky, Olivia Bennet let out a quiet sigh of relief as she leaned back into the plush first-class seat. After an exhausting week filled with a series of important meetings, she could finally savor a rare moment of peace. Through the window, she silently observed the bustling runway below, appreciating the precious tranquility amidst the usual noise of a commercial flight. Olivia's life had not always been filled with such privileges. She grew up in a modest neighborhood, where her parents raised her with unconditional love and strict discipline, instilling in her a resilient spirit to overcome the limitations that society often imposed. Through relentless effort, Olivia had now become the founder and CEO of a thriving technology company. She was the embodiment of perseverance and success, a living testament that with determination, nothing is impossible. This flight was supposed to mark a new beginning, a journey to finalize an important international partnership that could elevate Olivia's career to an unprecedented level. She gently adjusted the silk scarf wrapped around her neck, then reached for the leather briefcase beside her. In the cozy atmosphere of the first-class cabin, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended with the luxurious perfumes of the surrounding passengers, creating a refined harmony. A male flight attendant glided past, offering her a sparkling glass of water with a friendly smile. Olivia nodded slightly, bringing the glass to her lips, savoring the cool bubbles bursting on her tongue. Everything seemed perfect, but as Olivia was about to realize, perfection was sometimes just a fragile illusion. A sudden commotion from the front of the cabin pulled her out of her thoughts. Looking up, her eyes met the sight of a tall blonde woman stepping into first class. From her posture to her expression, everything radiated arrogance. A designer handbag dangled from the crook of her arm like a badge of status. Following closely behind was a shorter woman with brown hair, who appeared more reserved. Their whispers were loud enough for Olivia to catch a few sentences. "Can you believe this? What kind of seating arrangement is this?" The blonde woman's voice dripped with disdain. Her companion, who seemed uneasy, offered a nervous chuckle. "I know, Evelyn. But maybe it's just a mistake. They'll fix it soon." Olivia felt a slight unease as the two women stopped right next to her row. Evelyn's sharp gaze swept over her, and her perfectly manicured fingers drummed lightly on her designer bag. Olivia quietly turned back to the briefcase on her lap, unwilling to engage. She had encountered people like Evelyn before, people who saw her skin color before they saw the person she truly was. People who believed that her place in society was something to be negotiated. "Excuse me," Evelyn's voice cut through the air, cold and pointed. Olivia looked up, meeting her gaze. "Yes," she replied, her tone calm and measured. "I think there's been a mistake," Evelyn said, gesturing toward Olivia's seat. Clearly, this seat was meant for someone else. Olivia raised an eyebrow slightly. "This is my seat, 1A. I booked it weeks ago." Evelyn's lips curled into a forced smile that never reached her eyes. "You see, I'm a gold-tier member with this airline. I always get priority seating. I think you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." Olivia stared at Evelyn for a moment, letting the audacity of her words settle. "I'm quite comfortable right here, thank you." Evelyn's smile vanished instantly. Her companion shifted uncomfortably, clearly not wanting to be part of this confrontation. Before Evelyn could say anything else, a flight attendant appeared, his crisp uniform adding to his authoritative presence. "What seems to be the problem here?" the flight attendant asked, his gaze shifting between the two women. "There certainly is a problem." Evelyn's voice took on an exaggerated dramatism. "This seat, my seat, was mistakenly given to someone else. I need this resolved immediately." The flight attendant turned to Olivia, who remained calm yet unwavering. "There's no mistake," Olivia said firmly. "This is my seat and I have the ticket to prove it." The attendant hesitated, caught between Evelyn's entitled insistence and Olivia's quiet confidence. "May I check your ticket again, ma'am?" he asked Olivia, his tone polite but laced with doubt. Without a word, Olivia handed him her boarding pass. Her heartbeat remained steady, even as the tension in the cabin thickened. She had been here before, in boardrooms, on stages, in countless moments where subtle biases had challenged her place. Confrontations where she had to prove she belonged. This was just another test. The flight attendant examined the ticket, then gave a confirming nod. "This is indeed your seat, Miss Carter." Evelyn narrowed her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the flawless facade she had built began to crack. "That's impossible. She must have bought a last-minute upgrade. People do that, don't they?" Olivia held back a sharp retort, instead meeting Evelyn's gaze with unwavering resolve. "I suggest you take your assigned seat. This conversation is over. Evelyn's companion tugged at her arm, whispering something inaudible. But Evelyn wasn't ready to back down. I don't think you understand who I am, she said, her voice low but simmering with anger. I always fly first class. I can't just sit back and let someone like Evelyn, her friend hissed, cutting her off before the sentence veered into irreparable territory. The flight attendant cleared his throat. Ma'am, if you still have concerns, you're welcome to speak with our supervisor. Evelyn glared at him, barely concealing her frustration. Finally, with a huff, she turned on her heel, dragging her reluctant companion toward the front of the cabin. The flight attendant cast Olivia an apologetic glance before returning to his duties. Olivia watched them go, her expression unreadable. Around her, the weight of curious gazes from other passengers hung thick in the air, their silent intrigue filling the space. This wasn't the first time she had been treated like this. The woman arched a perfectly shaped brow, a flicker of displeasure crossing her flawlessly made-up face. There must be some mistake. I fly this route all the time and always sit in 1A. Olivia set her notebook down, her gaze steady and sharp as she observed the woman's every move. She had seen this scenario play out before, those moments when others looked at her with doubt as if she didn't belong. There's no mistake, Olivia said calmly but firmly. This is my seat. I booked it in advance. The woman took a sharp breath, her cold gaze flicking to Maya before turning to the flight attendant with an air of entitlement. I want to speak to your supervisor. Olivia pressed her lips together, leaning back in her seat. She wasn't surprised. She knew this wasn't over. The woman's perfectly manicured finger jabbed in Olivia's direction like an accusation, but the truth was clear. This was a misunderstanding. Olivia's heart sank. She knew exactly where this was going before it even began. The flight attendant checked his tablet and offered an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, ma'am, but seat 1A was booked correctly in our system. Miss Carter reserved it in advance. The woman's jaw tightened. Then what am I supposed to do? She demanded, her voice rising. I am a very loyal customer of this airline. There must be a way to sort this out. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable. We can try to make some arrangements. There's nothing to arrange, Olivia interjected, her voice calm but firm. She lifted her chin, meeting the woman's gaze directly. This is my seat and I have no intention of giving it up. The woman blinked, momentarily stunned that Olivia had dared to push back. Well, she scoffed, her tone dripping with condescension. I'm sure you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, perhaps in business class? But Olivia's expression didn't waver. She had spent her entire career facing down boardrooms full of people who underestimated her. And this moment was no different. I'm perfectly comfortable here, she replied evenly. The atmosphere seemed to shift. A quiet tension settled over the first-class cabin, growing sharper. Other passengers pretended not to notice, their eyes fixed on their tablets or books, but Olivia could feel their curiosity. Silent judgments hung in the air like an invisible weight pressing down on her. Let me handle this, the flight attendant quickly said, trying to defuse the situation. He turned to Olivia, his voice polite but carrying a subtle edge that unsettled her. Miss Carter, would you mind moving to another seat? Seat 2C perhaps? It's still in first class and would help us accommodate Mrs. Stokes. So that was her name, Evelyn Stokes. A name that carried the weight of elite clubs and generational wealth, Olivia thought. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms over her chest. I chose this seat for a reason, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'm not moving. Evelyn's face darkened. Unbelievable, she muttered, just loud enough for Olivia to hear. She turned to the flight attendant, her voice filled with frustration. Do you know who I am? I'm a Platinum Elite member. This is not how you should be treating one of your most loyal customers. The flight attendant swallowed hard, his gaze shifting between Evelyn and Maya. That hesitation said everything. He knew Evelyn had power, had connections. But he also knew Olivia had every right to keep her seat. And yet, in this silent battle of authority, Olivia could feel exactly which way the scales were tipping. I'll call the supervisor, he said before quickly walking down the aisle. Evelyn turned back to Maya, her lips curling into a saccharine smile. You could have avoided all of this, you know, she said, her voice sickly sweet yet dripping with insincerity. But I suppose some people just don't understand the meaning of compromise. Olivia tilted her head, staring directly at the woman in front of her. Compromise? She repeated as if weighing the word. Interesting choice of phrasing. Evelyn's smile faltered slightly. She opened her mouth to retort when the sharp, decisive click of high heels echoed through the first-class cabin. The flight supervisor had arrived. She was a middle-aged woman, her crisp uniform emphasizing an air of authority. "Is there a problem here?" Her voice rang out as she surveyed both Olivia and Evelyn. Before anyone could respond, Evelyn cut in. "Yes, there is a problem. I was supposed to be in seat 1A, but somehow she's sitting there instead." The supervisor's gaze landed on Maya. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in her eyes, recognition, perhaps? But whatever it was, it vanished just as quickly. "Co-Carter, would you be willing to move to another seat? Just to resolve this quickly?" Olivia tightened her grip on the armrest. She looked at the supervisor, then at Evelyn, and finally, her gaze swept across the other passengers. Those who were still pretending not to listen but were clearly hanging on to every word. She could feel the silent expectations, a wordless demand that she should concede, that she should be reasonable, that she should give up her seat to keep the peace. No. A single simple word. Evelyn let out a short, bitter laugh. "Unbelievable." She shook her head. "You're really going to make a scene over this? Fine. Let's see how far you get." Olivia smiled faintly, but her eyes remained cold and unwavering. Without another word, she picked up her phone and started typing a message. Despite the thickening tension in the air, her posture remained composed, completely unshaken. Just because you exist, people feel uncomfortable. The flight supervisor, Deborah, turned to Maya. The young woman still sat there, upright and commanding. There was something unshakable about Maya, a quiet strength that made people wary, without needing to raise her voice or show anger. Deborah hesitated. "Miss Carter," she spoke carefully, keeping her tone neutral, "I understand your position. But to resolve this matter more quickly, would you consider moving to another seat? It's still in first class and—" "No." Olivia cut her off. Her voice remained firm but devoid of anger. She didn't even bother looking up. Still typing her message on her phone, she continued, her tone unwavering. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." The supervisor's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at Evelyn, who was now pacing in the narrow aisle, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Evelyn's face was a portrait of frustration and impatience, as if she couldn't fathom why this argument was dragging on for so long. "Deborah?" Evelyn called out, her voice sweet yet razor-sharp. "I don't understand why this is still up for debate. She's being completely unreasonable. I am a Platinum Elite member. Do you know what that means? I have spent more money on this airline than she probably makes in an entire year. I deserve that seat." The air seemed to go still. Evelyn's words fell like daggers, sharp, deliberate, and meant to wound. A few passengers in the cabin exchanged glances, looking uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. At that moment, Olivia finally lifted her head. Her gaze met Evelyn's, sharp and unyielding. "Mrs. Stokes," Olivia spoke slowly, her voice smooth but as firm as cold steel. "Your membership status has nothing to do with me. I paid for this seat just like you paid for yours. If the airline made a mistake, that's their problem, not mine." Evelyn's face flushed red, her composure beginning to crack. "This isn't about money," she snapped. "This is about respect. People like you." She froze the moment she realized she had gone too far. Olivia raised an eyebrow slightly. "People like me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of thunder. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin froze. Even Deborah seemed to shrink under Maya's gaze. Evelyn hesitated, flustered, searching for words. "I didn't mean it that way," she stammered, her confidence beginning to waver. "What I meant was, clearly you're not someone who flies first class often and I—" Olivia raised a hand, cutting her off. "Stop." Her voice was firm, commanding. Evelyn flinched slightly but quickly masked her discomfort by tossing her hair back in defiance. "Fine." Evelyn turned to Deborah. "Are you really going to just let her get away with this?" Deborah could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze pressing down on her. The pressure was suffocating. She had been trained to de-escalate conflicts, to prioritize customer satisfaction. But this wasn't just a simple dispute. Deborah realized Olivia wasn't the kind of passenger who could be dismissed or pacified easily. There was something in the way she stood her ground, in the way she carried herself, that made Deborah understand. Pushing this any further would be a mistake. Finally, Deborah spoke, carefully measuring each word. "I'm afraid Miss Carter has the right to keep her seat. She reserved the seat and we cannot force her to move." Evelyn's face twisted with rage. "Unbelievable," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. "Is this the kind of service I get after spending so much money on this airline? I will report this to upper management, just you wait." Olivia remained calm, her eyes never leaving her phone screen. Go ahead. Her voice was steady, unwavering. But Evelyn wasn't done yet. She spun around, stomping down the aisle, muttering bitterly about entitled people and incompetent staff. Deborah let out a quiet sigh of relief. But that relief didn't last long. Just a few minutes later, Evelyn returned, this time accompanied by flight attendant Greg, who looked both tense and confused. She refuses to cooperate, Evelyn announced loudly, pointing at Olivia as if she were a misbehaving child. I demand that you do something. Greg looked at Maya, then back at Evelyn, hesitation clear on his face. He turned to Deborah, waiting for instructions. Before Deborah could say anything, Olivia stood up. In that moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on her. Every movement she made was deliberate, precise. She picked up her phone and pressed the call button. The quiet ringing of the phone echoed through the tense silence. I didn't want to do this, Olivia said, her voice calm but sharp as a blade slicing through the air. She glanced at Greg and Deborah, her gaze cold and razor-sharp. But if you want to escalate this, she continued, locking eyes with Evelyn, then I will do the same. Then, turning her back on Evelyn, Olivia spoke into the phone, her tone professional but edged with frustration. Yes, this is Olivia Carter. I am currently on one of your flights and I am experiencing an issue with your staff. All color drained from Deborah's face. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching and unclenching. Evelyn frowned, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. But Olivia didn't stop. No, I don't need compensation. I need a clear explanation. The silence in the cabin became suffocating. I want an answer before this flight takes off. And if I don't get one? Olivia glanced briefly at Evelyn, a subtle smirk forming at the corner of her lips. I will consider that a very clear message from your company. I will consider this a systemic issue and escalate it to the board. Olivia paused, letting her words settle into the heavy silence. Thank you. She ended the call, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and turned her gaze directly to Deborah. A faint smile flickered across her lips. Now then, Olivia said, her voice laced with icy authority, let's see how corporate decides to handle this. Deborah swallowed hard. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She didn't know exactly who Olivia Carter was, but one thing was glaringly obvious. This was not a battle she wanted to lose. There was something about Olivia's unshakable composure, the way she commanded the moment, that made Deborah instinctively tread carefully. Yet at the same time, the looming presence of Evelyn Stokes demanded an immediate resolution. Evelyn was not the kind of woman accustomed to waiting, or losing. Arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently against the sleeve of her designer blazer, a clear display of growing frustration. The smug smile she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a deep frown of displeasure. Well? Evelyn finally broke the silence, her voice sharp and commanding as she addressed Deborah. Are you just going to stand there and let this circus continue? Deborah hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Greg. He remained rigid behind Evelyn, his posture tense, his face unreadable. She knew she was walking a razor-thin line. If she sided with Evelyn, she could avoid the wrath of a Platinum Elite member, a highly valued customer of the airline. But if she went against Maya, she might find herself facing a different kind of storm, one far more serious, one that could directly impact the airline's reputation. And something in her gut told her that Olivia Carter held more influence than she let on. Deborah took a deep breath. Mrs. Stokes, she began, carefully modulating her tone. I assure you we are handling this situation. Please return to your seat for now, and I will personally follow up on this matter as soon as possible. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her nostrils flaring with fury. My seat? My seat. I was supposed to be sitting there. She jabbed a finger toward Maya, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that made a few passengers wince. Do you know who I am? It was a phrase Olivia had heard countless times before. She didn't even bother looking up, just flipped to the next page of her notebook, as if Evelyn's outrage was no more significant than the gentle rustle of paper. Her indifference, so calm it bordered on dismissive, only infuriated Evelyn further. I demand to speak to the captain. Evelyn declared, her voice brimming with indignation. This is unacceptable. If none of you will handle this, I'll find someone who will. At the mention of the captain, Deborah hesitated for a split second. Calling the captain to intervene in a passenger dispute was an absolute last resort, an escalation that could disrupt the flight and even delay the schedule. This was not a decision to be made lightly. Deborah took a step forward, lowering her voice in an attempt to calm Evelyn. "Mrs. Stokes," Deborah said, keeping her tone steady yet firm, "please understand that the captain's top priority is the safety of this flight. This matter does not need to be escalated to him. Let's resolve this here together." But Evelyn wasn't interested in listening. "Oh, I see," she scoffed, her voice sharp. "You're protecting her because you think she's more important than me, is that it?" She lifted her chin, eyes blazing. "Let me tell you something. If I don't get that seat before this plane takes off, your airline will be dealing with my team of lawyers." Olivia let out a quiet sigh. Finally, she closed her notebook with a soft but deliberate snap. She placed it on her lap, then looked directly at Evelyn. Her gaze did not waver, did not show anger, only calmness and unwavering resolve. "Mrs. Stokes," Olivia spoke, her voice calm yet as sharp as a carefully honed blade. "If you truly believe that your lawyers can resolve this matter, then by all means go ahead," Olivia said, her tone steady but cutting. "But before you do, I advise you to carefully consider the consequences of escalating a situation that you are clearly not prepared to handle." Evelyn blinked, unable to hide her confusion at the cold confidence in Maya's voice. "What do you mean?" she asked for the first time, a hint of hesitation in her tone. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing as if seeing straight through her opponent. "What I mean," she enunciated clearly, "is that intimidation and pressure tactics might work in some situations. But here they don't, certainly not on me and definitely not on the board members who will be reviewing this incident." She sat back, her expression calm, but her eyes radiated authority. "So I suggest you take your seat before you embarrass yourself any further." The air inside the cabin seemed to freeze. Deborah glanced between the two women, her stomach twisting into knots. She could see Evelyn's face flush red, her jaw clenched, struggling to find the right words to retaliate. But before Evelyn could speak, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Ladies." A commanding voice resonated from behind them. The captain had appeared at the entrance of the first-class cabin. Dressed immaculately in his uniform, standing with unwavering composure, his expression calm yet firm. His presence immediately commanded attention. Even Evelyn fell silent. "What is going on here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene with the measured neutrality of experience. Deborah quickly stepped forward, hoping to defuse the tension before things spiraled further out of control. "Captain, we're handling a minor seating issue. There's no need for your intervention." "I'll be the judge of that." The captain interrupted, his voice steady yet composed. He turned to Evelyn and immediately she launched into a tirade. Evelyn began a long-winded rant about her Platinum Elite membership, her loyalty to the airline, and the injustice of being denied the seat she deserved. The captain listened patiently, his face betraying no emotion. When Evelyn finally fell silent, he turned to Maya, his gaze softening slightly. "And you, ma'am?" he asked. "Do you have anything to add?" Olivia met his gaze without flinching. "No, Captain," she replied simply. "I paid for this seat and I will not be leaving it. If the airline made an error in Mrs. Stokes' booking, that is unfortunate, but it is not my responsibility to resolve." The captain nodded, his eyes lingering on Olivia a moment longer than usual before turning back to Evelyn. "Mrs. Stokes," he said firmly, "I understand your frustration. However, this seat was correctly assigned to Ms. Carter." His voice was resolute. "I must ask you to return to your assigned seat so that we can proceed with the flight." Evelyn stared at the captain, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But the captain didn't give her a chance to argue. "This is my final decision," he added, cutting off whatever protest was forming on Evelyn's lips. "If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to remove you from this flight." The entire cabin tensed, a collective breath caught in the air. Evelyn's eyes darted around, searching desperately for anyone to take her side. But no one did. Olivia quietly picked up her notebook, flipping to a fresh page, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say another word. Everything was unfolding exactly as she had predicted. Evelyn clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. "This isn't over," she hissed, glaring at Olivia as if she were the root of all her troubles. But Olivia didn't even bother to look up. And to Evelyn that was worse than any response. Perhaps that was the greatest insult of all. Olivia wouldn't even acknowledge her. Evelyn's furious footsteps echoed down the aisle as she reluctantly returned to her assigned seat. The air in the cabin grew heavy, an uncomfortable silence settling over the passengers, broken only by the faint rustling of fabric as people shifted in their seats. The captain gave Deborah a small nod, a signal that the matter was resolved, at least for now. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the cockpit. Deborah exhaled quietly, trying to steady herself. But the weight of the moment still lingered, pressing down on the cabin even more than the stiff collar of her uniform. Evelyn might have been temporarily placated, but her eyes still gleamed with the promise of retaliation. And then there was Maya, silent, composed, yet radiating an undeniable authority. Deborah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Olivia reopened her notebook, her fingers gliding along the edge of its leather cover as if grounding herself. On the outside she maintained an impeccable calm, a skill honed over years of practice. But inside a faint unease stirred. This wasn't the first time she had faced treatment like this. And though she rarely let it affect her, today felt different. Maybe it was Evelyn's particularly arrogant entitlement. Or maybe it was the crew's hesitation, their reluctance to act decisively. But something within her had shifted. Olivia lowered her voice, ensuring the conversation remained discreet. "There's been an incident," she said evenly, though the edge in her tone was unmistakable. "Passenger conflict. Mishandled seating arrangement. And a certain platinum elite member who thinks she owns the airline." Marcus sighed, a quiet, knowing exhale. "Let me guess. Evelyn Stokes." Olivia smirked slightly. "Of course you already know. I keep track of our high-maintenance clients," Marcus replied, his tone dry. "She's notorious for making noise. What do you need from me?" Olivia tapped a finger lightly against the cover of her notebook, considering. "I want a full review of how this situation was handled," she said. "And I want to know if she's pulled this stunt before." There was a pause before Marcus responded. "You're thinking of taking action?" Olivia's expression didn't change, but her voice was resolute. "I don't tolerate bullies, Marcus. And I don't appreciate hesitation when policies should be clear." Another brief silence, then Marcus let out a low chuckle. "Understood. Consider it done. I'm on flight 827 to Zurich. The crew just tried to pressure me into giving up my seat for another passenger, a platinum elite member who thinks the world revolves around her." Marcus took a sharp breath, clearly caught off guard. "They did what? You've got to be kidding me." "I wish I were," Olivia replied coldly. "This wasn't just a polite request, Marcus. They deliberately pressured me to prioritize her over me because, according to them, she was more valuable. When I refused, things escalated. They called a supervisor, and that person asked me again as if I hadn't made myself clear the first time." Marcus's voice turned low and sharp. "Unacceptable. Do you have their names?" "I do," Olivia replied firmly. "Flight attendant, Greg. Supervisor, Deborah Lane. And of course Mrs. Evelyn Stokes." "Leave it to me," Marcus said decisively. "I'll report this straight to the CEO. They'll be lucky to still have their jobs by the time you land." Olivia paused for a moment, gripping her phone tightly. "Don't stop at firing them," she said slowly, her voice low but cutting. "I want a full system review. This isn't just about me. It's about how many others have been treated like this. I'm tired of these exceptions becoming the rule." Marcus was silent for a moment, then his voice softened, carrying a clear note of respect. "Got it? I'll get started right away. In the meantime, do you need anything else, Maya?" Olivia hesitated, her gaze drifting out the window. The once vibrant sunset had faded into a soft twilight, the runway lights flickering weakly against the darkening sky. "No," she finally said. "Just take care of the rest." She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her jacket pocket. For a brief moment, Olivia allowed herself to take a deep breath, letting the steady rhythm of her heartbeat ground her. The storm wasn't over, but she had set things in motion. Now all she had to do was wait. Across the aisle, Deborah stole a glance at Olivia from the corner of her eye, unease creeping up with every passing second. The quiet confidence Olivia exuded wasn't just intimidating, it was unsettling. Deborah had dealt with countless difficult passengers throughout her career, but never had she encountered someone with the same quiet authority as Maya. There was something about her presence that made Deborah feel Olivia was far from just another first-class passenger. She cast a quick look toward the service galley, where Greg leaned against the counter, arms crossed. His usual cocky demeanor had vanished, replaced by a restless tension that had him adjusting his tie over and over again. Deborah decided to confront Greg. "Greg," she said, stepping into the cramped space. "We need to talk." Greg straightened up, his expression guarded. "About what?" "About this situation," Deborah lowered her voice. "I don't think you realize who we're dealing with." Greg scoffed, but there was hesitation in his tone. She's just another entitled passenger who thinks she's above everyone else. What's the big deal? Deborah frowned, her voice sharpening. She's not just any passenger, Greg. She has connections high up. Did you see how she handled this? She never raised her voice, but she bypassed the entire chain of command and called directly outside. I think we made a mistake. Greg shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Deborah's words settling heavily on him. You mean she has connections? I mean we should be careful, Deborah replied. And you should brace yourself for the possibility that this is going to come back to haunt us. Greg parted his lips as if to respond, but before he could say anything, the overhead speakers crackled to life. The captain's calm, professional voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just received an update from headquarters, and there will be a slight delay at the gate before takeoff. We appreciate your patience and will provide further information as soon as possible. A wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. Deborah's stomach tightened. A delay at this stage could only mean one thing: headquarters was now involved. She turned to Greg, her expression darkening. This isn't over, she murmured. Greg said nothing, but the look in his eyes said it all. For the first time he realized they had completely miscalculated. Olivia Carter, and that mistake could cost them everything. The low hum of the engines had quieted, replaced by the soft rustling of passengers settling into their seats. Conversations were stifled, as if everyone could sense that something bigger was unfolding. Olivia closed her notebook, resting her hand on the smooth leather cover. Outwardly she remained composed, but her sharp gaze reflected a psychological chess game, one in which she was already ahead. She glanced out the window where the airport terminal lights cast faint reflections on the glass. This delay was no coincidence. Marcus always worked fast, and if he had started pulling strings, things were about to unfold in ways no one expected. In the galley, Deborah and Greg whispered urgently, their initial unease now turning into real fear. I don't like this at all, Deborah muttered, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She had spent years climbing the ranks within the airline, building her reputation through hard work and finesse. But now she could feel the foundation of that work starting to shake. This delay, she continued, her voice lowering. It came from headquarters. Someone called in. Greg leaned back against the counter, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. The usual confidence he carried had vanished, replaced by a restless tension that made him seem smaller than ever. So what if someone called? He said, though his voice lacked conviction. We didn't do anything wrong. We asked her to switch seats politely and she refused. That's it. Deborah shook her head, her gaze sharp. You don't get it. This isn't about whether we think we were right or wrong. It's about how others perceive us. And if she really has connections to the higher-ups, we're in serious trouble. Just one passenger causing a delay like this? The way this looks could destroy us. Greg snorted, but the flicker of unease in his eyes betrayed him. She's just a passenger who knows how to intimidate, Greg said, though his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Probably knows someone in customer service and thinks she can make a big deal out of this. I'm telling you it's nothing. But the moment the words left his mouth, Greg felt the weight of Deborah's warning settle in his chest like a heavy stone. He had seen passengers threaten lawsuits before, but none had the calm certainty of Olivia Carter. This wasn't a bluff. This was a warning. In first class, Evelyn Stokes sat rigidly, her fingers tapping incessantly on the armrest in a rhythm laced with irritation. The delay did nothing to quell her anger. If anything, it fanned the flames. She couldn't shake the image of Maya's calm, unwavering face. The way Olivia had dismissed her request. As if Evelyn was nothing. She thinks she's better than me, Evelyn muttered, her lips curling into a sneer. Beside her, Linda shrank slightly, the confidence she had before now replaced by unease. Maybe we should just let this go, Linda whispered, glancing toward the aisle where Deborah and Greg were still deep in conversation. This is getting too complicated. Evelyn turned sharply, fixing Linda with a cold glare. Let it go. Do you have any idea how much money I've spent on this airline? How many hours I've flown in first class? I am not going to let some nobody humiliate me. Linda grimaced but said nothing, lowering her gaze to the magazine on her lap. But Evelyn wasn't done. She leaned forward, craning her neck to search for Maya. Olivia remained composed in her seat, as if none of this concerned her. Evelyn stared daggers at Maya, who was still engrossed in her notebook. Unbelievable. Evelyn hissed, her eyes blazing with fury. She's just sitting there like she owns the place. A flight attendant passed by, and Evelyn shot out a hand, flagging him down. Are we taking off or not? she snapped, her voice slicing through the hushed cabin. "This delay is unacceptable." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her outburst. "I'm very sorry, ma'am, but the captain hasn't given us an update yet. We'll be departing as soon as possible." Evelyn scoffed, waving him off with disdain as he hurried away. Olivia didn't so much as glance in her direction. But that, more than anything, only made Evelyn's anger burn hotter. 15 minutes later. The silence in the first-class cabin was broken by the soft hiss of the cabin door unlocking. Two sharply dressed men stepped inside. Their presence commanded immediate attention. One carried a sleek leather briefcase. The other held a tablet, his expression unreadable. Olivia cast them a fleeting glance, the corners of her lips curling into a faint smile. Marcus never disappointed. The taller man scanned the cabin, his sharp gaze sweeping over the passengers, until it landed on Deborah. Years of professional instinct made Deborah step forward automatically. "Are you Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor?" His voice was low but carried undeniable authority. Deborah swallowed hard and nodded. Deborah stared, her expression riddled with unease. "Is there a problem?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The man didn't reply immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the galley. "This way, please. We need to have a private discussion." Deborah and Greg exchanged another glance, then reluctantly followed. Their steps were stiff, weighed down by apprehension. A ripple of murmurs spread through first class. Even Evelyn bolted upright, craning her neck to get a better look at what was unfolding. Deborah's eyes widened in shock. Greg let out a sharp breath, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could somehow ground him. "Wait," Deborah started, but the man cut her off. "This is not up for discussion," he said firmly. "An internal investigation will follow. Until then, you are both relieved of duty." Greg's face turned ghostly pale. "But Your actions have already been documented," the second representative interjected, holding up the tablet. "We have all the reports we need." A deep silence settled over the galley. For the first time, Deborah felt the full weight of what had just happened. She had spent years building her reputation. And now, in the span of a single flight, it had all come crashing down. "The evidence speaks for itself," he continued. Deborah swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. Greg shook his head violently, grasping at straws. "We were just following standard procedure. The passenger refused to cooperate. What were we supposed to do?" The taller man remained unmoved. "This is not about what you think you were doing," he said. "It's about how your actions were perceived and the consequences they caused." Greg let out a frustrated, disbelieving laugh. "So that's it," he scoffed. "One complaint and suddenly we're the villains?" The second man finally met Greg's gaze. It wasn't just one complaint. Deborah stiffened. The truth settled like ice in her stomach. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the culmination of something much bigger. As Deborah and Greg were escorted down the aisle, whispers and murmurs rippled through the first-class cabin. Some passengers stole glances, others watched openly. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Evelyn crossed her arms, still fuming, still unwilling to accept what had happened. But Olivia didn't spare her a second glance. Instead, she turned her page, her fingers tracing over a new set of notes. Maya, without lifting her gaze, finally spoke, just a whisper, just for Olivia. "Was it necessary?" Olivia's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Always." The aircraft doors closed. The flight resumed. And the world moved forward, leaving Deborah, Greg, and Evelyn behind. The cabin door closed behind Deborah and Greg. The sharp sound was like a punctuation mark, signaling the end of a tense chapter. For the first time since the commotion began, the first-class cabin fell into silence. Passengers exchanged glances, whispered in hushed tones filled with curiosity. But no one dared to speak loud enough to be overheard. Olivia remained seated, her posture relaxed, as if nothing significant had just happened. She knew better than anyone, this was not the time to bask in victory. She was not the type to boast. Instead, she focused on something more important. The larger message this incident would send. This was not about revenge. It was about accountability. The two representatives from headquarters stepped out of the galley. The two men slowly made their way down the aisle. One of them stopped right beside Maya's seat, tilting his head slightly in a gesture of respect. "Miss Carter," he said softly, his voice calm yet filled with deference. "Everything has been resolved. Please accept our sincerest apologies for the inconvenience and the way you were treated. The individuals involved will no longer be part of this flight." Olivia met his gaze directly, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate your swift action," she replied, her voice steady but sharp, causing the man to unconsciously stand a little straighter. "However, I hope this doesn't end here. I expect a comprehensive review of the airline's policies and training procedures. This is not the first time I've witnessed something like this, and I suspect it won't be the last." "Of course, Ms." The man nodded immediately. "We will ensure that happens, you have my word." Olivia gave a slight nod, then shifted her attention back to her notebook. As if the conversation had ended. The man hesitated for a moment before stepping back, allowing her to return to her thoughts. But Olivia didn't need their promises. She had enough influence to ensure they followed through. And she would make sure they did. All across the cabin, Evelyn was seething. Her face was flushed red, and her fingers gripped the armrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The smug satisfaction she had earlier had completely vanished. In its place was a simmering rage, radiating off her like waves of heat in the summer. "Absolutely ridiculous," Evelyn hissed, her voice low but brimming with anger. "Completely absurd." Linda, sitting beside her, leaned in gently. Maybe it's better if we just let this go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not worth causing more trouble." Evelyn snapped her head around, her eyes blazing. "Let it go. What just happened?" Evelyn roared, her voice filled with fury. "They just threw me out, me. A Platinum Elite member. Do you have any idea how much money I spend on this airline every year? And yet they treat me like her." She spat out the last word like it was poison, jerking her chin toward Maya's seat. Linda shrank back slightly, her gaze flickering toward Maya. But Olivia remained completely composed. If she had heard Evelyn's outburst, she didn't react. And that unwavering calm only fueled Evelyn's anger even more. "This isn't over," Evelyn growled, her voice cold as ice. "I'll make sure corporate hears about this. I have connections." Linda sighed, the uneasy feeling in her chest growing stronger. She was beginning to realize that Evelyn's stubbornness was no longer determination. It was desperation. But Linda didn't dare say that out loud. Not while Evelyn was in this state. The overhead speakers suddenly crackled to life, the captain's voice filling the cabin, steady and professional. "Dear passengers, we apologize for the delay. Once again, your safety and satisfaction remain our top priority. We will be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." The announcement sounded standard. But Olivia noticed a subtle shift in the tone. A firmness, as if the crew had been instructed that no further disruptions would be tolerated. The cabin doors remained sealed shut. And the tense atmosphere slowly began to dissolve as passengers returned to whatever they had been doing. But for Evelyn, the captain's words were the final straw. She shot up from her seat, the abrupt motion drawing every eye in the cabin. "Unacceptable." Her voice rang out, sharp with indignation. She scanned the aisle, as if expecting someone from management to appear. "I have been loyal to this airline for years, and this is how they treat me? I demand to speak to someone in charge immediately." Several passengers started glancing at each other, exchanging uneasy looks. Even Linda, clearly embarrassed, shrank into her seat as if wishing to disappear. Before anyone could respond, one of the two representatives from corporate stepped forward. His expression was unreadable. He approached Evelyn, calm yet commanding. His voice was low but razor-sharp. "Mrs. Stokes," the man said, "we have received reports that your behavior has disrupted the cabin environment. Unfortunately, we must ask you to disembark from this flight." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious," she sputtered. "You're kicking me off just for standing up for my rights?" The man remained unmoved. "Our priority is ensuring a safe and comfortable experience for all passengers. Your actions have compromised that. Security personnel are waiting outside to escort you from the aircraft." Evelyn's face flushed red with rage, her fury on the verge of exploding. "This is outrageous. Do you even know who I am?" The man remained unfazed. "We acknowledge your Platinum Elite status, Mrs. Stokes. However, that does not exempt you from following airline policies or respecting other passengers." For a moment, Evelyn looked as if she wanted to argue further, but the murmurs spreading throughout the cabin made her hesitate. She glanced around and, for the first time, realized she had lost whatever sympathy she might have had. The expressions of the other passengers ranged from indifferent to barely concealed satisfaction. No one was on her side. Olivia didn't even look up from her notebook as Evelyn was escorted down the aisle, her resentful voice fading with each step. The cabin door opened briefly, the hushed voices of security personnel carrying through before it shut once more, sealing in an overwhelming silence. At last, the plane began taxiing to the runway, the roar of the engines washing away the tension of the past few moments. Dui de la ban dike tieng en qua don ban kung cap, kung voi fan tip noi ka chuyen. Olivia glanced out the window where the endless night stretched beyond sight. The distant lights of the terminal grew smaller as the plane continued to taxi. Olivia allowed herself a small smile, calm, content, and utterly confident. She didn't need to say anything to Evelyn directly, but her presence alone had been enough. Olivia understood that true power didn't require loud declarations or ostentatious victories. Sometimes, it was simply the quiet resolve that forced the system to correct itself. As the plane lifted into the night sky, Olivia leaned back into her seat, her mind already shifting to the work ahead. She knew this incident was only the beginning, there was still much to be done to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The faint hum of the aircraft engines filled the cabin, a steady rhythm that accompanied Olivia's thoughts. She reached for her tablet, scanning through emails and schedules, recalibrating her focus. A soft chime sounded above, the flight attendant call button from a few rows behind. Olivia didn't turn, but she could sense the tension still lingering in the cabin. Evelyn might have been removed from this flight, but her presence had left a mark. A shadow approached. Olivia looked up to find the flight captain standing beside her row, his expression unreadable yet composed. "Miss Carter," he spoke with measured professionalism. "I wanted to personally extend my apologies for everything that transpired earlier. That should not have happened." Olivia met his gaze, studying him for a moment before responding. "I appreciate that, Captain," she said evenly. "But apologies mean nothing without action." The captain gave a curt nod, understanding the weight of her words. "I assure you this matter will be thoroughly addressed." Olivia held his gaze for a beat longer before inclining her head slightly. "Then I hope to see real change." The captain hesitated briefly, then stepped back. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Carter." As he walked away, Olivia exhaled slowly, shifting her attention back to her screen. This was just another battle in a much larger war, one that she had been fighting for years. And she wasn't done yet. Karma, she thought to herself, always finds a way to work itself out. The cabin door shut with a decisive hiss as Deborah and Greg were escorted off the plane. The murmurs from the passengers suddenly ceased, all eyes turning toward the first-class cabin, where Olivia sat. Her composed demeanor hadn't changed, but now, her presence carried a weight that no one could ignore. Evelyn, sitting stiffly in her seat, crossed her arms with a huff. "Good," she said loudly. "I hope they replace them with people who are actually competent. This delay is absolutely ridiculous." Maya, who had remained silent throughout Deborah and Greg's removal, finally looked up. She studied Evelyn with a gaze that was calm yet piercing, not filled with anger or malice, but with an unwavering strength that cut through Evelyn's carefully crafted facade. "You still don't get it, do you?" Olivia's voice rang through the tense cabin, quiet but undeniable. Evelyn blinked, momentarily thrown off, not by the words themselves but by the sheer directness of them. "Excuse me?" Evelyn scoffed, her brows knitting together in irritation. "This was never just about a seat," Olivia continued, her tone even but resolute. "It's about respect. About how you and people like you believe the world should revolve around you, no matter who gets hurt in the process. But today you've learned a lesson, things don't work that way." A flicker of something, perhaps realization, perhaps resentment, crossed Evelyn's face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. And for the first time since the confrontation began, she had nothing left to say. The cabin remained silent. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The plane began to taxi, its engines humming steadily as the world outside blurred into streaks of light. Olivia exhaled softly, allowing herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The fight wasn't over, not in the grander sense, but for now justice had been served. And that was enough. Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but Olivia raised a hand, stopping her. "You assumed I was beneath you simply because I didn't fit the image you expected in this cabin." Olivia's voice never rose, yet every word cut through the air like a razor. "You used your privilege to try and take something that didn't belong to you." The cabin was suffocatingly silent. Every passenger held their breath, watching. Evelyn's face flushed red, her composure beginning to crack. I didn't mean, she stammered. You did, Olivia interrupted, her tone unwavering. And now you have to live with the consequences. Evelyn had no response. Every eye in the cabin was on her now. Some passengers nodded in quiet agreement with Maya, while others simply turned away, unwilling to be involved. Before Evelyn could muster a final retort, one of the airline representatives returned to the cabin, his demeanor calm and professional as he approached Maya. Miss Carter, he said respectfully, we've resolved the situation. On behalf of the airline, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the unacceptable treatment you experienced today. Olivia gave a small nod, but she didn't smile. I trust you will be conducting a full review of staff training procedures and company policies? Her voice was firm, leaving no room for vague reassurances. The representative straightened slightly under her gaze. Yes, ma'am. We will ensure this does not happen again. Olivia studied him for a moment, then inclined her head slightly. See that you do. The hum of the engines grew louder as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Passengers began settling back into their seats, the tension slowly dissipating. Evelyn, however, sat stiffly, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she had been forced to face a truth she had long ignored. And whether she admitted it or not, she knew, this was a lesson she would not forget. As the plane ascended into the night sky, Olivia leaned back, exhaling softly. This battle was over. But the fight for change had only just begun. Of course, ma'am, the man responded immediately. We will implement new regulations right away. And as a gesture of goodwill, the airline would like to offer you complimentary first-class travel for the next 2 years. Olivia tilted her head slightly, considering his words. But there was no trace of satisfaction in her expression, only a quiet certainty like the calm after a storm. Thank you, Olivia said, her voice steady. But what I truly want is accountability. Not just for myself, but for every passenger who has ever been treated as lesser simply for who they are. The representative nodded, respect evident in his gaze. You have my word. He turned to leave, prepared to exit the cabin. But before he could take a step, Evelyn surged forward, her anger flaring up once more. Wait, she snapped. What about me? I'm the one who's been inconvenienced here. I'm a Platinum Elite member. Do you have any idea how much money I've spent on this airline? A tense silence fell over the cabin again. Some passengers exchanged glances, others simply looked away, unwilling to be part of the spectacle any longer. The representative turned back, his expression remaining composed but firm. Mrs. Stokes, he said, his tone measured, your status with the airline does not exempt you from following our policies or respecting fellow passengers. Evelyn scoffed, her face turning red. Respect? You're taking her side? After all I've done for this company? This is not about taking sides, the representative replied smoothly. This is about fairness. And today fairness prevailed. Evelyn's mouth opened, but no words came out. She was used to getting what she wanted, to bending rules in her favor. But now, for the first time, she had run into something immovable. She turned toward Olivia, eyes blazing, searching for some kind of reaction. Anger, gloating, even pity. But Olivia merely looked at her with a quiet, knowing gaze. No need for gloating, no need for further words. The message had already been sent. And Evelyn understood. She had lost. With a sharp breath, Evelyn sank back into her seat, crossing her arms in bitter silence. The aircraft engines rumbled as the final preparations for takeoff were completed. Olivia took one last glance out the window, where the airport lights flickered in the distance. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she closed her eyes. This chapter was over. But the work, the real work, had only just begun. The representative turned back, his gaze cold but still polite. Mrs. Stokes, he said, his voice calm yet firm, your actions today have been witnessed and documented by multiple passengers. The airline has decided to revoke your Platinum Elite membership, effective immediately. Evelyn froze, her jaw dropping in shock. What? You can't do this. I have rights. You do, the man replied smoothly. And so does every other passenger. Your behavior today has violated the airline's code of conduct, and we take that very seriously. Security will now escort you off the aircraft. A wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. 2 uniformed security officers appeared at the doorway, making their way toward Evelyn. She tried to protest, her voice rising in pitch as she demanded to speak with someone higher up. But no one responded. She was led away, her outraged shouts fading into the distance. Finally, the plane began to taxi toward the runway, and the commotion from moments ago quickly became nothing more than a distant memory as passengers settled back into their seats. Olivia gazed out the window. The city lights below shimmered faintly against the glass. Silence wrapped around her, not the awkward silence of tension, but the quiet stillness of justice served. The silence now was no longer the awkward hush of tension but a quiet reverence. No one spoke, yet every passenger on the flight seemed to understand that they had just witnessed something significant. Olivia Carter, without raising her voice or losing her composure, had stood her ground and changed the course of that day. As the plane soared into the night sky, Olivia leaned back into her seat, her notebook still resting on her lap. She did not smile, but in her eyes was a quiet satisfaction. This had never been just about her. It was for everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel as if they didn't belong. A few weeks later, the airline released an official statement, announcing the implementation of new diversity and inclusion training for all employees, along with stricter guidelines for handling passenger disputes. The incident on Flight 827 was never explicitly mentioned, but those who knew understood. This was a turning point. This was not just a victory. It was a lesson. Respect is not just a courtesy, it is a necessity. And those who forget that will, sooner or later, face the consequences. And just like that, the tide had turned. What had begun as an assertion of privilege had ended as a profound lesson in humility and respect. This story serves as a reminder to all of us. No matter who you are, treating others with dignity and respect is non-negotiable. In the days that followed, Maya Carter's story spread rapidly across social media. Many passengers from Flight 827 shared their accounts, expressing how they had witnessed a moment where justice and respect were reaffirmed. Maya hadn't sought attention, but she understood that what had happened could spark real change. One morning, as she sat in her favorite cafe, Maya received an email from the airline CEO. In his message, he thanked her for speaking up, acknowledging that the incident on Flight 827 had prompted the company to re-evaluate its policies and customer service culture. He invited her to a special meeting to share her insights on how to improve the flying experience for all passengers, regardless of status or background. Maya hesitated for a moment. She hadn't intended to continue this conversation, it had already made its impact. But then she realized, real change only happens when someone is willing to push forward. And she wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for so many others. She typed her response, agreeing to the meeting. As she closed her laptop, Maya glanced out the window. The morning sunlight streamed through, casting a warm glow on her face, filling her with a quiet sense of peace. She had turned an injustice into an opportunity for transformation. And that, more than any apology, was the greatest victory. As she stepped out of the cafe, Maya allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She understood that the road ahead would be long. But she had already laid the first bricks toward a fairer world, one where respect was no longer a privilege but a fundamental right for all.